All right, so for everybody that's on right now, you can scan this and actually you'll be able to connect with Real Momentum on social media. I would love for all of you to scan this and join us on social media because I share a lot of amazing videos and tricks and simple things that you can do in real estate in order to keep your business moving forward, to connect with clients, to nurture them. So we'd love to have you, and you can scan this and join us on social media. Now, this was me when I first got into real estate, because I literally, that was 2002. I felt lost and alone, and I didn't know anything about what was going on, and nobody wanted to give me any guidance. It was literally sink or swim. And I didn't know what was holding me back, and I certainly didn't know the things that I didn't know yet about what I needed to know about real estate, which over the past 20 years, I've learned so much about it. So I'll continue with a short slideshow after we're done. And now I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to our special guest, Richard Stanley.
Okay, I guess, am I on the air now?
You are on the air, my friend.
Am I going to be up on this? Okay.
We're going to make you famous.
Thank you, Ophir. And I also want to thank Edgar Garcia for helping out with the technology here so that we don't have any glitches. And I think at the end, we'll have some time for questions, right, Ophir?
Absolutely. We're doing,
Okay.
If you guys have any questions at the end, raise your hands and we'll absolutely allow you to ask your question.
Okay. And thank you for the glowing introduction, Ophir. I just want to add that I am not an architect. I am a realtor. I've been a realtor since 1987. And I have lived in LA for 50 years. I came out here. I have an MFA in photography, but that's my background educationally. But one of the things that I really was drawn to when I came to Los Angeles was the variety and quality of architecture. And first thing I did after I bought my Thomas Guide was to buy the Guide to LA Architecture by Robert Winter and David Gebhardt. I think you can still get it. Although unfortunately they are both no longer with us, but that book goes neighborhood by neighborhood through Los Angeles and gives you sort of the greatest hits of each neighborhood and tells you about the houses that you can walk by, which is what I did, how I got started in this. And then eventually I was invited to join a boutique that specializes in architectural and historic houses. And I've been doing that more or less ever since. So some of this is related to my experience in real estate. And when I say the MLS, I mean the CLAW, which probably all of us use, or most of us. So anyway, I'll start the keynote.
Go back to the Zoom.
All right, we're going to have Edgar help here. Oh, I'm going to share and then go. Is it this one?
Yeah. So we're going to go desktop 2.
And then start keynote.
Where's the
Keynote's right there. Oh, not there. The next one. As they used to say on TV, please stand by. Okay. And then we're going to do, all right. And then play.
Oh, right. So no, that's not it. There.
And then play.
All right. Now we're going to do play.
Okay. Okay. I think this should work.
Here we
So
go.
this is a little graphic that I thought would be fun to start out because it shows a little of the things that we'll get into later. And so my title of the lecture is What is Architecture? I think that's a logical starting point. And Frank Lloyd Wright, who was probably the most important architect of the last 200 years, certainly always thought that architecture was shelter in the open. And I thought this was a nice slide because it shows it's an illustration of an Indian farmhouse in the area of Bengal, which is how we get the The name bungalow. It's from Bengali architecture. And I thought also it's sort of to give you a sort of a grounding as we get started. I heard a radio lecture a few years ago, and the man made a great point. Is there some way we can turn this one down so we don't get the feedback? Yeah, great, thanks. So, and his point was that today's architecture kind of has two major camps. One camp is into building or creating objects, and the other camp is more more concerned with creating great spaces. And I think, to me, a work of great architecture works on two levels. There's the exterior that gives you a hint of what the interior space is, the shelter, if you will, what that's all about. So here I thought there are several kinds of objects on the left. I think we can see the cursor here. Of course, the pyramids, this is Disney Hall, and this is also, this is by Frank Gehry, and he also did this. It's the Chiat Day advertising agency in Venice. And I thought that Frank Gehry, a very celebrated local architect, is very much, I think, a frustrated sculptor. And I think a lot of his buildings give you no real indication or hint as to what the space is inside, unlike some of the historic ones here. This is, of course, St. Peter's in the upper right, and the interior, the Bernini interior. The one in the middle here is Dulles Airport by Eero Saarinen, and you can see the beautiful space inside. It's all about this great big hall here. And the one on the bottom is the famous Silvertop House by John Lautner in Silver Lake. And there you can see this beautiful roof, which I think the roof in architecture is really key. And that's one of the problems I had with Frank Gehry. I don't think he is involved very much in roofs. There's no roof on either of these buildings particularly, but these two over here give you that great sense of shelter within. So what is style? And again, going back to Frank Lloyd Wright, style is principle applied. And I thought that the quintessence of style as an illustration might be classical columns. Here you have the Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, and then down here kind of a composite. And they have a principle in each one that's a little different, but the general function is similar or the same. And the thing that got me started on this was I went to the MLS years ago. This is the current MLS menu that you use when you enter a house. It'll look familiar into the MLS system. You have to choose what is the style. And we have currently 42 different styles that you can select on the on Slim in the MLS. And of course, one is the California bungalow up here. I'll show you right here. And when initially, these are houses that were in the MLS years ago. And if anybody can tell me the style that connects all of these, I'd love to know, because these were all listed in the MLS as Craftsman bungalows, which of course, none of them is. So let's look at what is an architectural house. This is a house in Silver Lake by Rudolf Schindler from the early 20s, the Howe House. My definition of an architectural property is that it's professionally designed by an architect, a trained professional. They can be any style, anything that an architect has laid his or her hand to could be considered an architectural house, although most people think of them as in the modern vein. And here we go back to Rudolf Schindler's Howe House at Silver Lake. And I think you have a beautiful sort of yin yang here of the exterior, showing you pretty clearly what the interior, or hinting pretty clearly as to what the interior looks like below. Here's another modern house by Ray Cappy. And it's, I think it's by Ray Cappy. Maybe I'm wrong. But anyway, this is in the Hollywood Hills. And it shows you the exterior and interior. was built by a realtor, by the way. And here are some other architectural houses. The one in the upper left is the Gamble House in Pasadena. And then the other three are by Wallace Neff. And you can see there are three completely different styles, including the bubble house that I'll tell you more about later. And these houses were also marked in the MLS as architectural. And I think they have really very little architectural imprint upon them, certainly not what I would claim as my work if I were a professional. I think the house on the left may be one of the ugliest houses in Los Feliz too. I don't think it looks like that anymore. And so thinking of modern architecture, a lot of people, I think, mistakenly mix up modern and modern. A modern house, and these houses, by the way, are all from roughly the 20s and the 30s. This is the Barnstall House by Frank Lloyd Wright here in Los Feliz. This one is a William Kesling house in Silver Lake, and the house in the lower right is a landmark modern house by Richard Neutra in Los Feliz. But the modern houses tend to be, this one is Frank Lloyd Wright was very eccentric architect, and he had his own sort of style. And Richard Neutra here on the lower right was part of what became known as the international style. And the house by Kesling on the left Kesling was supposed to be, I don't know whether this is true or not, Rudolf Schindler's contractor. He went out on his own and did a bunch of streamlined modern houses, which were very trendy at the time. And they embraced more curves and softer edges than the international style, which was very right angle. A lot of people, these houses in the streamlined modern style were very popular for about 5 years in the late 30s. And then they just kind of disappeared with World War II. A lot of people didn't like them at the time because they said, why would I want a house that looks like my dentist's office? And then mid-century modern houses, of course, mainly after World War II, although some were built in the 30s and the 20s. But here are, what most people consider mid-century modern. This is a Gregory Ain fourplex down in the lower left. It's a really wonderful one. I believe this is a house in Mandeville Canyon. And this is on the lower right is the Chemisphere house that's owned now by the publisher, the German publisher. And I think this looks like, I think it's a Gregory Ain, and this is a Richard Neutra. This one, I think, these two, I think, are related. I'll get to those in a minute. In the 20s, there was a lot of especially commercial architecture that was influenced by the then new style after World War I of Art Deco. And the Art Deco was a very specific, handcrafted, elite, high-end kind of style that evolved with the Depression into a more popular or populist kind of style that was more machine made and had a more manufactured, not by hand, but by machine kind of evidence. This is Bullock's Wilshire up here by the Parkinson father and son team. This is a mural in the back, which I don't know whether you can see that, whether you can just go in the back now. The Bullock's Wilshire was really a kind of a landmark building, not just because of the way it looked and being on a part of Wilshire Boulevard that was then being developed from raw land practically, but also it was the first store that turned, instead of having its main entrance at a busy public street, it turned it to the back where the parking lot was so that people could pull in, and most people entered the store after they parked or had their cars parked. and they viewed this mural up here, which was by Herman Sachs, I believe. The building here in the center on the left is the Pantages Theater. This building here is by Lloyd Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright's son, also known as Frank Lloyd Wright Jr. It's known as the Jaws Building. It's here in Los Feliz on Franklin, and this is also by Lloyd Wright on the lower left. And it's from the late 20s, early 30s, and was built for Antonio. No, not Antonio Moreno. It was built for another movie star whose name escapes me right now. But all of these are pretty much 20s, including the car, which was designed by Harley Earl. It was his first production automobile for Cadillac. And it dates from this period here. This was built by, it's a 1928 LaSalle. It was built by Cadillac. It was a sort of a high-end car, custom made but manufactured. Over on the right, we have what evolved into the 30s. This is the 20s on the left, the 30s on the right. You have everything from the famous pencil sharpener to the Coca-Cola building near downtown. This is another Kesling building here on the right in Los Feliz. This is a streamline steam locomotive. It is steam powered. And then the May Company. And finally, Union Station, which is a sort of a Spanish revival, but very modern. And you can see a 1938 Cadillac here. And you can see in 10 years, roughly, how cars evolved from the Art Deco era to the modern area of the 30s. Also, what was going on in Los Angeles at that time was a popularization of a very elegant Hollywood Regency style. I'm not sure that it was ever called that at the time. In retrospect, it acquired that name. This was by James Dolina. It was built for George Cukor in about 1936. This one is the Sunset Plaza Apartments, which were obviously enough, Sunset Plaza and Sunset, and they were torn down in the 80s illegally, and the city, in an attempt to create apartments, it was a sort of a real estate redevelopment, and people were so outraged, even though it was declared a historic cultural monument in the city of LA, that the city imposed a restriction on the developer that they could put only about 3 or 4 houses there instead of their big project. And of course, the Hollywood Regency was very popular with movie stars like Joan Crawford and Jean Harlow. And this is the John Wolfe's interior staircase in the Gershwin house. I'm pretty sure this was torn down for redevelopment in Beverly Hills. This is also by John Wolfe, and it was built for an interior designer and his very wealthy wife, the Pendletons, and it's now owned by the man who owns the Discovery Channel, I believe. It was Robert Evans' house, the producer. The big thing that I find fascinating about this, the Hollywood Regency, is that it sort of alludes to the older style of the early 19th century, but it uses modern technology. For example, the really curious thing about this fireplace is that there's no central chimney. The smoke goes up one or both of the sides into the flues, which are on these in these columns, not through the center, which again, lavish use of glass. This is also a Hollywood Regency house that I had listed a number of years ago on Mitchell-Torina Street in Silver Lake. And it happened to me a couple of times, and I'll show these briefly to you, that when I put a house on the market, sometimes people will come literally out of the woodwork and come to an open house with original photos of the house. And this house was built by Lester Scherer, who worked with Paul Williams on the Sunset Plaza apartments. And he designed this house for a doctor, pardon me, in Silver Lake. And the family came, the grandchildren, or one of the grandchildren came with these photos that were taken in 1936 or so, when the house was brand new and their grandparents had just moved into it. And I think it's fascinating to see the original photos and how people actually lived in these houses. This is a 1936 kitchen. And here's the interior of George Cukor's house. These interiors were done by Bill Haynes. Again, this is all Hollywood Regency, very expensively turned out. The room in the middle has a copper cornice, a copper fireplace, all custom made, inlaid wood floors, and the walls were upholstered in genuine suede with brass tacks that sort of ran along the top. It was an oval shaped room, and that's, of course, what it was always known as, the Oval Room. And the pictures below are as the house was redecorated in the 1980s and 90s by the current owner. And you can see how, I mean, I'll leave it up to you whether you like the original 1930s style or the current shabby chic iteration of it. Here's the original fireplace now. It's kind of sad to me, but that's the way it goes. So Craftsman bungalows, big influence in domestic architecture all across the country. They were very popular, but they were locally adapted to the needs of the climate and the tastes of the people that lived there. The idea of a bungalow having originated in India, warm climate, they wanted shade, deep eaves, big porches, lots of windows and doors to allow cross ventilation. Maybe not the best thing, and low hipped roofs, as you can see on the top picture. Maybe not the best choice if you live in Minnesota, where it can get pretty snowy and very cold, but the look was what people wanted. One of the things that I like about a lot of Craftsman houses, the original ones, are these wonderful River Rock or Royal Rock piers that hold up the porches and the chimneys are made out of. A bit of warning on that, though. The foundations can also be made out of river rock, which is not a great idea, nor are these structurally in an earthquake zone. So if you sell one of these, be careful. Here are some other bungalow precedents. Of course, the upper ones are the real bungalows, the farmhouse, and a little fancier one in India, tropical climate. And the bottom are the Japanese houses, which again are very wood, very clean and simple. And the thing that the Japanese house, I think, really contributed to modern architecture were the movable sliding panels to divide spaces as they might be needed. And here's the Gamble house, probably the greatest intact Craftsman bungalow probably in the world. It's an original photograph of it in the early 20th century. The interior ones, you can see the way the joinery is created here, as in Japanese type houses, which the Greens were familiar with. The glass here in the entryway is Tiffany. Lots of custom touches here with the bas relief. The carpets are original. The furniture is original. It's sort of a miracle it survived without being painted white in the 70s and 80s. And speaking of paint, here on the left, you can see two photographs of the house. This is the way it looked for many years. And then they did a research and restoration. It did research and a restoration in the actually, I think in the 2000s. And they painted it to look the way they suspect it looked at the beginning of the 20th century with the original types of colors here. Other kinds of bungalows all over the country. They adapted them, sort of a colonial revival bungalow here in the lower right. Here's a row of bungalows, every one slightly different here in LA. And this one in the lower left is more of a Dutch gambrel roof kind of a bungalow. And here you have sort of concrete piers and a little bit of a Norman or Tudery kind of half timber detail in the eave there. A typical house, and you can see a lot of these in neighborhoods that were built about 1890 to 1920, are American four-square houses. They are sort of like the backbone of American domestic architecture. Any of these houses could be anywhere in the United States, and a lot of them were sold as patterns out of catalogs, or even shipped pre-cut, pre-finished, and shipped out wherever they were headed on railroad cars. And there are a lot of, not a lot, but there are some houses that I know in Los Angeles who were, that started out exactly as a pre-cut kit that sometimes even the owner could put together on site. There was a local company that did this called Pacific Ready Made, I think it was, who actually created these prefabbed houses in pieces. This is a cottage. These are cottage variants that are very easy to identify. The one in the upper right is, at least I think he still owns it, is owned by a realtor. Started out as a set at the Irvin Willett studio in Culver City, and was later moved to Beverly Hills and finished off as a real house. There was an attempt a few years ago to tear it down and put in a McMansion, but thank God that the realtor saved it. And then these are some other examples of cottages. Here's a sort of a Tudor half timber detail again. And these are the real cottage precedents, both in Europe above and the log cabins below. A lot of old farms. I grew up near Philadelphia, and a lot of the old farms in the area in which I grew up would have the original log cabin on the property as a kind of accessory building, or it became a kind of utility building after the main house was built, usually in the mid 1800s. But the log cabin from the 1700s, even the 1600s, remained. It's surprising how old some of the oldest buildings in the East are in fact log cabins, and they still exist. These are modern cabins, all different kinds from all parts of the world. Country English houses are pretty easy to determine. They have steep, hipped roofs, gabled, and I guess you could almost call them kind of pointy. And here are some variants. Most of these I think I took in Hancock Park, which is a good place to see. The English houses, by the way, became popular, generally speaking, contemporaneously with the Spanish houses that we are familiar with, the pre-war ones, and also moved into the 30s. The French Norman was a kind of a variant of the English house. And here are some of the original ones at the top. And one of the things, if you ever go to Normandy, you can see the iris are planted at the roof ridge here, and they actually do bloom when they're in season. This building in the lower left is in Los Feliz, and it's a kind of amalgamation that Bernard Maybeck did for the California Packard dealer, Earl Anthony. And it's lately been the subject of controversy because I believe Katy Perry tried to buy it and then was frustrated by another woman who bought it. And there was a dispute over who had the ownership rights and the sale rights. It was a big real estate sort of train wreck, and I don't know what the current status. I know the archdiocese was sued the nuns who sold the property, and eventually the archdiocese won, but I don't know what the status of it is now. But it is one of the, I've been through the building. It's one of the greatest tour de force efforts of the 20s, and it's right here in Los Feliz. And then, of course, this is a very typical Norman French little house of the 20th century. French influence also carried over into the Chateau-esque and what's known as the Second Empire style, which usually has this mansard roof here. This building in the lower left is the largest structurally masonry building in the world. It's the Philadelphia City Hall. Was built over a long period of time right after the Civil War, and you can see it has the mansard roofs here, typical of French influence in domestic architecture. Of course, this is more of a chateau-esque apartment house here in Los Angeles, and again another sort of Frenchified house in Hancock Park. Victorian houses are very hard to pin down. There's so many varieties. Victoria was the queen for a very long time, from about 1840 until 1901 when she died. So if you call something built after 1901 Victorian, you're not really correct. But there was a large part of the 19th century that could correctly be called Victorian because they had so much variety. This house in the upper left is the greatest Victorian mansion, I think, probably that exists, and it was built in Eureka, California, by the Newsomes, Samuel and Joseph Cather Newsom. They were Philadelphia architects, and they came to California during the golden era boom of the late 19th century and built a lot of houses up and down the California coast. Many of their houses were lost in the 1906 earthquake, but a few of them still survive, including these two. The Pink Lady is also by them. These are both in Eureka, both built by the same family. The Pink Lady, I understand, was given by the owner of the Carson Mansion here at the top left to his son as a wedding gift. This is a Victorian Gothic cottage in Massachusetts, and in the lower right is a Victorian house in, believe it or not, Ottawa, Canada. These are all houses that are in Heritage Square, which, if you don't know it and you've never been to it, I highly recommend it. It's off the Pasadena Freeway in, I guess you would call it Mount Washington area, Glassell Park, and it's at the base of Montecito Heights. I think you get off at Avenue 43 off the Pasadena Freeway. And these were all houses that were, with the exception of the Octagon house on the bottom, which was moved, I think, from South Pasadena, maybe somewhere in that area. But the other three were all Gothic houses, or rather Victorian houses, that were built in Los Angeles in the Bunker Hill area and slated for demolition. A lot of them were saved in the 60s when they were being, when that whole area was being cleared, moved out to this scrap of land that the city owned as a sort of an outdoor museum. Unfortunately, a lot of them were lost by arson, by vandals, but these have survived. And you can see a lot of, this one looks like a Joseph Cather Newsom kind of style. This one has, and the two on the left have Italianate kind of influences. This one has sort of a Second Empire roof, and a lot of them had, like in the top left here, a kind of a widow's walk balcony that people could actually go up there. They're often very tiny. It's not some place where you would hang out a long time, but it's sort of a fun little feature. This one has the little sort of oculus windows here in this roof here. You see a lot of the gingerbread Carpenter Gothic, and the one on the lower left, I think is interesting because people think, well, you know, why are some painted white and why are some painted multicolored, gaudy colors? The reason is that white paint was used extensively to paint houses from about World War I on. It wasn't really available prior to that because they had trouble getting a white pigment, in this case, white lead pigment that would be weatherproof until about the beginning of the 20th century. And then it became a big selling point to make your house clean in the sort of an antiseptic movement that was going on at the time, and paint out that tired old high upkeep multicolored Gothic Victorian gingerbread kind of look that the upper right house has. So the paint companies greatly promoted the white lead paint, which was used all over the country. And if you have an old house before 1978 and you know how to use the lead disclosure, it's because the paint companies promoted the use of it so much during so much of the 20th century. The house on the bottom is an octagon house. They were a kind of a novelty during the Victorian era and very popular in certain areas. And Carroll Avenue, again, if you haven't been to Carroll Avenue, it's one of the greatest neighborhoods in Los Angeles. And this one here with the sort of moon balcony here, I believe was done by Joseph Cather Newsom. Many of these houses are on their original foundations, but not all. I believe the one here, the yellowish one on the left, was moved, I think, twice. Once I think originally it was downtown, and it was moved up the street. Then Bunker Hill happened, and it was moved over to Carroll Avenue. In the upper left corner, this little bungalow kind of house here, my understanding is that it was a prefab. And this is what the interior of, I believe it's this one. I think this is the interior of this. A lot of people who love these houses really get into the whole ethic or ethos of living there. And down on the lower left is a great relic of a prior era, is a still in use market with the original sort of clear story windows here at the top, which usually were covered over many years ago by electric signs. Spanish houses. So let's talk a little about Spanish houses. The precedents are, of course, Spain. These two pictures in the upper right are of the Alhambra in Granada, which is if you there's one place to see in Spain, go to the Alhambra. It's unbelievable. The tile work. It's a kind of quasi restoration, but you can go through the Alhambra and you can be in the room where Ferdinand and Isabella commissioned Christopher Columbus to go on his voyages. This is the Court of the Lions here, which is a sort of a must-see. The plaster work and the whole ambiance of the Alhambra, which is a really kind of like a mountaintop fortress, is incredible. On the lower left is a house in Mexico. Of course, the Spanish imported their style to Mexico, and this is a view of Mission San Antonio, I believe, which is, if I had one mission in California to go to, just to get the feel of what it was really like in California in the late 18th century, early 19th century, I would go to Mission San Antonio, which is in Central California on the other side of Hearst Castle. So what popularized it, what really got the Spanish style going in California was the fact that what was going on in about 1915? Well, the Panama Canal was being opened, and there were two California expositions, one in San Francisco and one in San Diego, that were celebrating the fact that there was this new route from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. You didn't have to go around South America or through a jungle to get to the West Coast or travel across the continent by train. You could actually go through the Panama Canal. So this San Diego Exposition was in Exposition Park, appropriately, in San Diego, and they wanted to get a theme. And the fellow who was put in charge of the theme liked Irving Gill, was a modernist architect who had worked for Frank Lloyd Wright in Chicago. I believe he developed health issues, tuberculosis perhaps, and his doctor told him, move to California for the climate. A lot of people came out to California around the late 19th and early 20th centuries for the climate, the tubercular sanatoria, and so on. So Gill came out here and he began working in San Diego, and his ideas were very clean, almost sugar cube kind of pure modernist types of houses, as well as some vernacular styles. But he was trying to get the theme commission for the San Diego Exposition. Unfortunately, through political maneuvering, he got outmaneuvered, and Carlton Winslow, who lived in Laughlin Park in Los Feliz, got the commission, and Winslow and some of his comrades were gaga over the Spanish colonial Baroque architecture, Churrigueresque, if you will. And that's what they used as the theme for the buildings in the San Diego Exposition. Some of these are still standing. You can see here is a stamp that had publicized the exhibit, and there even was a Fatty Arbuckle movie that was shot in 1915 at the Exposition. So people flocked to the Exposition by train, most of them, and fell in love with these romantic Spanish Baroque works. Flash forward to 1925, there's a big earthquake in Santa Barbara. The city looked probably a lot like Los Angeles on a smaller scale, and it was demolished. This is a picture in the upper right of the Santa Barbara Mission. And the city fathers decided, the Exposition in San Diego was such a success, we should have that kind of atmosphere in our city permanently, and not just for a couple of years or a year as an exposition in San Diego. So they adopted the Spanish colonial revival architecture as a theme for the entire city of Santa Barbara, which is why it looks so beautiful today and why it's so popular. And these are some of the houses locally. I don't know, some of these might be, I think most of these are in the Hollywood area. Oh, the one back here, this one I think is back east. They did actually build Spanish houses even in places like Pennsylvania. It's shocking. But this is an old listing of mine that supposedly Fatty Arbuckle may have rented for a while, but it's a beautiful example of Spanish colonial revival. You can see that inside they used a liberal amount of decoration, but they used these Churrigueresque columns, kind of Bernini-esque, like in St. Peter's. This is in Mexico. And if you ever want a treat architecturally, go to Guadalajara. This house was built in the 1920s by Luis Barragan, and I think some of you may be familiar with him. And it's restored beautifully. It's now sort of an exposition space, but you can see not all clay tiles are red. He glazed them here, almost like looking like celadon green from the Orient. And it was originally yellow. And the reason Spanish houses were colored pink or yellow or something other than pure white is that a lot of them are originally whitewashed for sanitary reasons, and also just to make them look better, aesthetic as well. So in some tropical climates, whitewashed houses were considered impolite to your neighbors because in the sun they were so bright that they were hard on the eyes. This is in an era when people didn't have sunglasses as we do now. So to tone down that harsh, bright whitewash, they would add local clay. Now, the local clay could be red, which would yield pink houses. It could be reddish yellow, which would yield houses that look like this. And you can see that this is not a sort of an ancient house. You see these little touches here, like where these almost Joseph Albert paintings were a square and a square and a square on the outside, as well as some of the traditional arches and columns like down here. It's a great house. I highly recommend you go see it if you ever get to Guadalajara. Mediterranean houses. This is a village in Provence on the lower left. You can see a lot of things that look very familiar to us in California. Here's a house this is Los Feliz and Griffith Park in about 1921. And they are in the process of building this house right here. These little tents here along Commonwealth were where the workers would live during the time that they were building the house here, which is on Aberdeen. This is the house as it looked completed. You can see there was very little landscaping or shrubbery. This street here on the left, if you can see my cursor, is Vermont. This is on the way into where the Greek Theater is now, and up on the top of this hill on the far left, eventually, about 10, 15 years later, would be where the observatory would be built. But in the meantime, people were buying the lots up here. It was considered almost like living out in the country. And these are some of the photographs from, this says right here, July 1922. You can see it really looks as though you're out in the desert. And it was built by, a lot of people think it was Morgan Walls and Clements, but it really wasn't. It was Frank Moline, and he was a very ambitious developer in the 1920s. He had about 5 offices, including one at Hollywood and Highland, one in Pasadena, downtown, and so on. And he would hire young architects and have them design houses, including people who went on to later fame, like Wallace Neff. And this was done, I don't think it was done necessarily by Wallace Neff, although he could have worked on part of it for Frank Moline. But Frank Moline really was the developer of this house. They would design a custom house for you. These are all original photos. Again, the original family provided them to the seller. And oh, by the way, this house here, I believe up here, no, I'm wrong. I don't think this is not the Hillhurst house, but I thought it was at first. These are some more photographs of how the people really looked, and these, I think, are the owners sitting in their garden. And the garden is very much patterned along the gardens in the Alhambra in Granada. But you can see how different it was for people living in this house originally than the way Hollywood decorators put them together now. This was a beautiful outdoor room that was destroyed by a celebrity owner later because he had kids and he turned it into a lawn instead of this beautiful patio. It also had secret rooms, and this is a different house, but again, it gives you this Spanish revival. This house was in Woodside in Northern California, and it was done by a man who did local houses in Pasadena and San Marino and places like that, George Washington Smith. But the house, and you see this fellow here these two may look familiar. This is Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. The house was owned by Steve Jobs and his then partner in the business in Woodside. It had acreage and they split up. I forget the fellow's name. And he got the partner got the house and restored it beautifully. Jobs later got it back and decided that he wanted to tear this house down and build a new house. People believe to spite his partner, whom he could no longer stand. It had its own Aeolian organ in here. It was loaded with tile that was made only a few years in Morocco, on and on and on. It was a gorgeous house. He tried to get a demolition permit from the city of Woodside, and they wouldn't do it because the whole neighborhood was in an uproar that this landmark would be demolished. So Jobs let the house literally go to hell by no maintenance for years, to the point where they had no alternative but to give him the demolition permit. And as soon as the permit was issued, he had a group of workers descend on it, and as they say, they mulched the house, and that's the house turned to mulch at the bottom. Some of the artifacts were saved, but the house is, of course, gone. The southwestern houses were, again, Spanish influence, also Native American influence, and this is sort of a mission revival kind of influence in the upper right. That house is in Angelino Heights in LA. Whoops. What's going on here? I don't see us moving here. Something happened here. Let me try to see, where are we here? Excuse me here while I think somebody there. Okay, Monterey Colonial. Can I go back? No, it's not working. Something's wrong.
Okay.
You want to do it?
So you want,
It's back here, probably. There. No, that's gone ahead. That, and can I?
so this is the mold.
Oh, that's the mulch. Now I don't have control.
Not yet.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so backing up a bit, southwestern house. This house, by the way, down here is in Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. I've never been there, but there are many haciendas, and you can see the adobe brick that it was originally built out of. I'd love to go on. I've heard there's a whole bunch of missions in Baja too that are somewhat looking like that. This house in the upper left is in Santa Fe, New Mexico. This is back east. And the house in the bottom, I think, is a local LA house, but the bubble houses, which kind of resemble the Santa Fe look, are actually in France. And speaking of bubbles, the house in the actually, these things, I take that back. These are in yes, these are in France, and these are Wallace Neff houses in the upper part. Wallace Neff, the architect who did some of the most beautiful Spanish revival houses, Mediterranean revival houses, also was thinking during World War II of how to make, I think every good architect's goal in the back of their mind is to make low-cost housing for the masses. They really have this, at least most of the ones in the 20th century had a real sense of social consciousness. So Wallace Neff thought like an easy way to do it might be to take some of these balloons that were perfected, if you will, during World War II, and to blow them up and then to gunite the exteriors and then deflate the balloon and create houses made cheaply and easily reproducible for low-cost housing. So he had some of these developments on both coasts. I think one was done near Washington and one was here in Pasadena. There is one in Pasadena that still exists, so you can take tours of now and then. It's pretty amazing, but the problem is that it is a roundish house, and when you have a round ceiling or curved ceiling like this, you have acoustic issues. It's hard to fit windows in, and try to find furniture that'll fit on a curved wall. So it gets a little dicey. This bubble group here is very Wallace Neff, but it's actually in Turkey. And on the lower right is a hotel, believe it or not. Pardon me, very pricey. These are inflated bubbles, and it's in the Valle de Guadalupe, which is Mexico's wine country in Baja, but stunning visually. Monterey Colonial. So a lot of people think Monterey Colonial is like Spanish, but it really is more derived from New England architecture that was brought to California by the whalers. And where did the whalers go? Of course, they went to the Monterey Bay, which became a big whaling port. And they adapted some of the things from New England with some of the things from Spanish California, Mexican California, such as the upper level balcony and the general shape of the roof. And here are some examples of Monterey. These, I think, are all from Monterey, California. And these are Monterey Colonials in Los Angeles. And this is one that I had for sale that was very Monterey influenced. That was done by an architect named Arthur Kelly. It's here in Los Feliz. Arthur Kelly also did the Playboy Mansion, by the way. And Southern colonial houses are easy to spot because they usually have the columns in the front and sort of a nod to Greco-Roman influence. And many of the ones, like the one in the upper left, although I think that most of these, at least these two on the left, are in Beverly Hills. But the one in the upper left is a lot like houses in Key West, where they have the porch covering the whole front of the house, just to kind of give the interior some shade and the opportunity to control airflow. And they did have them in smaller scales. And traditional houses and are sort of updates to the original colonial houses. The classic colonial house is the lower right, which is a New England salt box. You can see because it looks like a salt box. This in the real salt box, which it used to be in the local food store, this part would be a flap that would lift it up. So you could store things down here, and they would get you a scoop full of salt or whatever was in here. And then they added the broken pediment and kind of neoclassic, and these are all looking like New England houses, but you'll find replicas, especially in Hancock Park. And here are some local ones. And some of these I would call California. This is a classic sort of 1930s California colonial. By the 30s, the Spanish houses had gone out of style. Hence, if you watch Double Indemnity, you can sort of appreciate the 1940s dig at one of those great big old Spanish barns that the narrator says in the beginning. And finally, the ranch house. Obviously, the house on the left is a real ranch house, but it was a very clean, simple, usually one-story design that was very easily replicated in the post-war American housing boom, as on the right. And they could also be adapted by the architects locally in Mandeville Canyon in particular. And finally, is the McMansion. These are what many of the houses that were actually beautifully designed but small were torn down in Beverly Hills, and all of these houses are the Beverly Hills McMansion. And I have read that people no longer want those houses with the columns in the front, I hope. But we'll see. But these are no style, such as a mobile home. And that's it. Okay.
I love it.
Any
Thank you.
questions?
All right, let's open it up. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, can you tell me what the name of that book you were talking about at the beginning was? Is it an architectural guidebook to Los
Yeah.
Angeles?
It's a guide to LA architecture, and it's by David Gebhardt and Robert Winter. Robert Winter, I didn't know, I never met David Gebhardt that I can recall. I believe he taught at UC Santa Barbara. Pardon me, but Robert Winter was one of the most charming, fun, bubbly kinds of folks you could ever meet. And he taught at Occidental College, and he lived in the Arroyo in Pasadena in the Batchelder House. And Batchelder was a group, or I believe they were a family or brothers or something. Anyway, Ernest Batchelder, it was his own personal house, and he made, as for a living, he made tile, and his house was filled with his work of tile work. And Robert Winter had the opportunity and wonderfully acquired the house, and he and his wife lived there for many, many years. But it's right on the Arroyo in Pasadena. It's easy to spot. But he co-wrote it with David Gebhardt, and I have a bunch of them. They came out in different sizes, all of them a thick, a good many pages, but in a nice size that you could carry.
What
They
would,
probably sell them used on Amazon.
yeah, I'm gonna definitely get one. I have one more question for you. What would you say is the most architecturally significant neighborhood in Los Angeles? It kind of sounds like it might be Los Feliz.
Yeah, it kind of might be. It's one of the reasons I live and work in Los Feliz. And I think that there are really, if you look at Los Angeles and the development of it and what's left here, there are only two sizable neighborhoods in the city of Los Angeles that have never gone through the economic cycle from being desirable, new, to kind of worn out and then sort of decline. A classic example would be the Victorian neighborhood of Angelino Heights. When Angelino Heights was built in the 1880s and 90s, it was during a time of real estate boom. And it was along with Lincoln Park, those were the first two suburbs of Los Angeles when people grew out from the core of downtown Los Angeles. And a lot of the working class people lived in Lincoln Heights because it was close to the railroad. And that's where a lot of them worked. But the carriage trade moved to Angelino Heights, which is this hilltop, not very big actually. And they built their mansions there, but very quickly, by 1902, I had a listing years ago. I think it was 1440 Carroll Avenue, and it was built as a mansion for people from Pennsylvania, and they bought the house next door for their daughters. But by 1902, they sold it to the Jewish community of Los Angeles, in particular, the man who owned Union Bank, and he bought it for the Jewish community as a tubercular sanatorium. So it had already passed from being a residence to, in effect, a hospital. And after that, it was sold in 1912 and carved up into 4 units. And then during World War II, a lot of those houses that maybe had started out as single family and evolved or devolved to multifamily were then further subdivided because there was a housing shortage in Los Angeles. And I remember when I first moved here, my first apartment was a 1-bedroom apartment in Sherman Oaks on Dickens Street that was built in 1940. And the owner, my landlady, owned it from new. And she told me that during the war, 8 people lived in that 1-bedroom apartment. And I said, well, where did they all sleep? And she said, well, they were never here all at the same time. They all worked swing shift at Lockheed. So, they would do what became known as hot sheeting. One guy or woman would get up and leave the bed, and the next shift would arrive and they'd crawl in and sleep. So you would have 8 unrelated people living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Los Angeles during World War II.
Wow.
I don't think the housing shortage is ever going to change. It seems like the lot sizes, right?
Well,
Right.
that's true
LA?
too. A lot of those big houses, like that house that Steve Jobs owned, it was something like, I don't know, 20 acres in Woodside. Imagine like having 20 acres in Beverly Hills. Like it was written on the wall that was going to be subdivided.
No.
Amazing.
So
Any other questions? Nope.
Richard,
That was
it's
easy.
Marion. I just
oh
wanted
yeah,
to
hey,
say,
there you are. How are
I
you?
just want to say it was amazing. I loved every bit of it, and I do have a ton of questions, but I'll have to bug you about those later.
Okay, anytime. But I would think that anybody who is interested in architecture should definitely start out with that handbook, that guide to LA architecture. I hope it's still in print. When Robert Winter, he was the last to go. He died about, oh gosh, right before COVID, I think. And he was so brilliant. And really, I miss him. But I hope somebody picks up his mantle with David Gebhardt and updates it, because the reason they kept doing all those different additions is because the city is rapidly evolving. And things that are here today could be gone tomorrow.
Yep.
Things that nobody ever imagined, could have a revitalization or built new. Architecture is a living phenomenon, and I hope it never stops, and we get into like, what do they call it? 3D designed houses where they're just literally spit out, or you go there with a machine and some software and you pour in the plastic chips and you end up with a house. I hope it doesn't quite end up like that, but I don't know. I don't think I'll have to worry about seeing that.
You could just task AI with building it for you.
Yeah, exactly. A token.
Perfect. Any other questions? So,
All right.
perfect. So guys, first of all, thank you so much, Richard.
Thank
Let's all
you.
give Richard a big round of applause. Thank you for taking your time and sharing with us your amazing wisdom. And we will
Thank you.
be waiting for the bus tour of Los Angeles. I'll be putting
Right.
that together next.
Okay. Thank you
And
all. Take care.